It's a vast field, and there are many people working on very different topics, using very different approaches, that call themselves neuropsychoanalysts or who say that they're doing neuropsychoanalysis. That's not unusual. The same applies to psychoanalysis. There are many people who you might cringe when you realize that they're associating themselves with your beloved field, that you don't want to have anything to do with those people. You think that they're wild or that they don't begin to understand what psychoanalysis is really about, but they proudly stand on the rooftops and say, I'm a psychoanalyst, or I'm doing psychoanalysis. The same applies to neuropsychoanalysis. Perhaps because it's a relatively new field, and it's not that new anymore, I hasten to add, it was with some shock, and again with some pleasure, that I realized recently that neuropsychoanalysis has been going since the mid-1980s. If you count the first publications in that field, it's been going formally under the heading of that name and with an organization attached since 1999. If you count it from the mid-1980s to now, that's more than 20 years. And the whole history of psychoanalysis is only 110 years. So it's a substantial portion of the history of psychoanalysis already, this thing that we call neuropsychoanalysis. But nevertheless, it's relatively new. And I think perhaps all the more when a field is relatively new and it's finding its feet and it attracts all kinds of malcontents and all kinds of dabblers, as did psychoanalysis in the early years. Also some incredibly creative people. It takes a while for it to take its final shape. That said, I really do dissociate myself from a lot that goes under the heading of neuropsychoanalysis. And what I'm going to focus on in these three sessions today are three aspects of neuropsychoanalysis which I think are good neuropsychoanalysis and are interesting and are positive and are good for psychoanalysis. In introducing you to these three dimensions of neuropsychoanalysis, I hope I'll give you some sort of sense of the breadth of what goes by that name, and also by implication, in the process, tell you something, or you can infer what sort of things I don't think on neuropsychoanalysis. Not that I can decide. I can't tell people you're not allowed to say what you're doing is neuropsychoanalysis. But it is very handy that we're moving toward a period now where we're going to have formal training in it, and then there will be people who will be formally able to call themselves neuropsychoanalysts because they've done the training. And like happened in psychoanalysis itself, in this way we'll gradually be able to formalize things. What I'm not going to do is spend a lot of time on the sort of historical and philosophical background. That, too, is a big topic, and it's something I could talk to you about at great length. But I don't want to. I rather want to dive into the sort of meat and veg of it as quickly as possible. I need to, however, at least refer to one or two things which I think are the absolute headlines about the history and the philosophy underlying neuropsychoanalysis. I think the main historical facts are something that increasingly people do realize, but not long ago very few people did realize, is that Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis, was a neuroscientist. Freud did neuroscientific research for more than 20 years. He published more than 200 titles, if you include reviews, more than 200 neuroscientific papers. That includes also 3 very substantial books on neuroscientific topics. All of this preceding psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis, in a very real sense, evolved from Freud's neuroscientific work. He moved from studying the structure of the neuron through to tracing particular neural networks in the brain, tracing the origin and termination of particular nerves and nerve tracts in the brain. A move from very lowly animals, crayfish and fishes, through to ultimately to humans, starting with human fetuses. He studied the development of the nervous system in fetuses, humans, then gradually moving up and up and up until eventually he was studying clinical problems in adult neurology, and then culminated in, and by the way, in passing there, he became one of the world's leading authorities on what's now known as cerebral palsy, the movement disorders of childhood, neurogenic movement disorders of childhood. He then moved on ultimately to the topic of how language is represented in the brain. And that is nowadays part of the field that we call neuropsychology. And it was through his grappling with that problem, as language, of course, being a psychological faculty, that he started to think about how the mind and its organization might differ from the brain and its organization. The anatomy and physiology of the brain, it's not immediately apparent from looking at the structure of the brain how a mental function might be organized in it. In the case of language, Freud came to recognize that there were laws governing the organization of language which transcended the basic anatomy of the brain. There was a need for a whole other way of thinking about it in order to understand it. There was a book that Freud published in 1891, which is currently available in a translation called On Aphasia, but a new translation is going to be coming out soon with a more accurate title, which is Conceptualizing the Aphasias. And this was really a profound contribution to the field. It was recognized and still is recognized as an absolute milestone in the history of behavioral neuroscience and neuropsychology. So as Freud started realizing that the mind is organized not in terms of the static fixed anatomy of the brain, but rather in terms of dynamic interactions between component parts of the brain, that it's a sort of a superstructure, it's a functional arrangement with dynamic interactions, as I say, between component parts, so he started to think psychologically. And that led on to what then became psychoanalysis. Where he started to realize that you need to think about the functional organization of the mind in its own terms, in addition to being interested in how it might relate to the anatomy and physiology of the brain. But the other main reason why Freud moved from being a neuroscientist to being a psychoanalyst was because they weren't, as he moved up the spinal cord and up the animal series to these most complex problems of human neuropsychology. So he was confronted with the recognition that there were very limited tools available in the 1890s to study these very, very complex aspects of brain function neuroscientifically. In fact, those days, there weren't even scans, it wasn't even possible to know where the damage was in somebody's brain until they died. And at autopsy you'd find where the damage was and so on. So they were really groping in the dark. And Freud, moving as he did through this succession of levels of complexity, started to grapple with aspects of mental life, started to study how the mind works, aspects of how the mind works, which needed to be studied. They were terribly important things. What makes us tick is not a small matter. What is the structure of the human personality is not a small matter. What causes neurotic and other psychiatric problems are not small matters. But Freud very reluctantly had to recognize that we need to study these things, but we can't study them neuroscientifically because there are no neuroscientific methods available for studying them. And he had a real crisis in himself, an identity crisis at that time, about what is he doing? He's become this wishy-washy thing called a psychologist. He wants to be a right-wing neuroscientist. If you read those correspondences around that time, that really was the case. But he reluctantly had to acknowledge that the only way in the 1890s that we can study the laws governing the mind, the structure and function and organization of this part of nature called the mind, the only way we can study it is psychologically. Psychological methods were the only methods that could do the job. For all of their faults, and all of us know that psychology has got many problems. Studying mental experience in and for and by its own methods is very difficult in relation to other natural sciences. The physical sciences are a hell of a lot easier. But to his credit, Freud recognized that we had to abandon the false security of anatomy and physiology and deal with mental phenomena in their own terms using the best methods available to us at the time. So he started to say in his writings things like in the interpretation of dreams, for example, in 1900. He said, I'm well aware that the thing that I'm describing to you here in chapter 7 of the interpretation of dreams, this thing which we're calling the mental apparatus, that this thing can also be studied from a neuroscientific point of view. But I'm leaving that side out of account. And I beg you, follow me in doing it this way. There are things to be gained by studying it this way. Leave the anatomical and the physiological side alone. We can't solve these problems that way. This is the way we've got to go. And we all know that Freud said that, and all of Freud's followers, were happy to go along with that. And in succeeding generations, this has become sort of ossified in an attitude in psychoanalysis, which is, as a matter of principle, we eschew the physical. We don't study the mind chemically and physiologically and anatomically. We are psychoanalysts. We look at it in purely mental terms. Freud said we must do it like that. What we forget when we espouse this principle is that for Freud it was not a matter of principle. For Freud it was a matter of expedience. It was that if we want to learn about how the mind works, here in the 1890s, the only methods available to us are psychological. Drat, what a pity. If only that were not the case, then we could also look at the anatomical and physiological and chemical side of things, but we ain't got those methods. So that's why you, my followers, Freud said, must abandon the false security of those methods. It's false security. Those methods are too crude. They're not up to the job. Then Freud said one day, and he didn't say this once, he said this throughout his life, one day it will be possible to study these things neuroscientifically, and by God, I look forward to that day. One day we will be able to rejoin our psychology with neuroscience, and we'll be able to put it onto a stable footing. Because, and Freud said this, because we all recognize that when you can study things physically, it's much easier. You can have a much more secure basis for your knowledge, because there are things you can do physically in science, with matter. You can measure it, you can cut it up. You can say, this one looks exactly like that one. This one's twice as big as that one. This one's joined to that one. In ways that you can't with the fleeting and fugitive stuff of mental life. So Freud saw as a tactic that psychoanalysis must first study these things psychologically in their own right, because the mind is organized in its own way and because we only have methods to study it psychologically at this point. Once we've gone as far as we can that way, hopefully neuroscience will have developed methods which we can make use of. And so the main point I'm wanting to say in terms of the historical background is that that point has now arrived. Freud would have, I have absolutely no doubt, and believe me, I know Freud's work intimately because I've had to plow through every bloody word of it in German and try and understand what did he mean so that I could put it into English. I really feel that I know what Freud's view was on this matter. Freud welcomed, he enthusiastically anticipated the future time when it would be possible to rejoin psychoanalysis with neuroscience. What neuropsychoanalysis is, in my opinion, is simply that. It's taking advantage of the changed circumstances with advances in neuroscience, which now makes it possible for us to link what Freud and his followers learnt about the mind back to the secure physical stuff of the brain. It's as simple as that. That's what we're trying to do. As I'm sort of alluding to, it's unfortunate that many psychoanalysts think that this is a bad thing, that this is somehow a kind of a treasonous act for us psychoanalysts to be talking about the brain. That this is a neurologizing of the mind, that this is a reductionist, a materialist sort of view, that these people don't understand that we are psychologists, we study fantasy, we study the immaterial world. Why do they have to spoil our fun like this? They may say that, that's their prerogative, but they are not speaking in the name of the founding fathers of psychoanalysis. I don't believe that we are doing violence to the basic pillars on which psychoanalysis stands by trying to bring everything that we've learned about the mind into connection with what we now are able to learn about the brain. But that leads to the philosophical point. There are many different views about how the mind and the brain relate to each other in philosophy. I take a very common sense view of the relationship between the mind and the brain. It's rooted in a particular philosophy. I won't bore you with the philosophies, but I will tell you that this is the philosophy that Freud followed too. And it took me quite a while to understand what Freud's philosophical position was on the relationship between the mind and the brain. But eventually I did understand it, and I was, as with so many other things that Freud had to say about the world, I was persuaded that that was a good way to look at it. I'm not going to put it in too technical terminology. I'm just going to put it in a kind of common sense way. Basically, the philosophical position is this. When you look at yourself in the mirror, or look at yourself like this, you see that you have a body. And that body is Mark Solms in my case, Sue Levy in her case, etc. This physical thing, this body, is you. But if you close your eyes and don't look at that physical world, you're aware of something else called you. That's your mind, yourself, your subjective experience. There's an objective physical representation of you, which is your body. That's the thing you see in the mirror. And there's a subjective psychological representation of you, which is what you experience yourself introspectively to be. The philosophical position that Freud follows, which I follow too, and which I frankly don't see how anybody of sound mind can't see, is that those two things are the same thing. They aren't two Mark Solmses, the one that you guys are all seeing and the other one that I'm experiencing myself as being. They're one and the same thing. It's the same part of nature. This is the part of nature, thank God at the moment, occupied by a thing called Mark Solms. And the physical body of Mark Solms and the subjective being of Mark Solms are the same thing. That is a philosophy. It's called monism. It means there aren't two. There's no dualistic Mark Solms. There isn't the mind of Mark Solms, which is a separate thing from the body of Mark Solms. And the same applies to each and every one of us in respect of our own beloved selves. I'm not going to philosophize much beyond that, except to say that, nevertheless, there are two different ways of observing this part of nature. The one is subjective experience, the being of the thing. And that's how psychoanalysis studies this part of nature. Psychoanalysis's point of entry into the life of the mind, the nature of the mind, is through the subjective being of a mind. That's our observational perspective. And we've developed all sorts of methods and technical terms and concepts derived from the application of that method to try to infer from subjective experience as reported to us by our patients and experienced by us subjectively with our patients, to try to infer how the mind works. So our data is subjective experience. From that data, we build models of how the mind works. These are our inferences from subjective experience. And we had, starting again in 1900, in Chapter 7, Freud built a model that he was able to infer from the subjective stuff called dreams. he started to build a model of how the mind works, what its basic component parts are, how these relate to each other, and then he developed it with increasing experience, the accumulation of more and more observations, testing those conclusions against the observations of subjective reality. So we've improved, and since Freud developed even further our models of how this part of nature called the human mind, how it works. The mental apparatus in Freud's terminology. If you look at the human mind from the external point of view, you see that it is a thing. It's an organ. Just like I said, when I look at myself in the mirror, I see I am Mark Solms. If I look at myself in a scanner, I will see that there's this brain, which is called Mark Solms. And the neurosciences study Mark Solms and things like him, that is to say, human beings. They study them not from the point of view of being that human being, but rather from the point of view of, as opposed to subjectivity, of objectivity, seeing it as an object, studying it as a physical thing. And they do experiments on that physical thing. They cut it up, they measure it, they stick chemicals into it, and they see what happens. And on the basis of all of these multiplicity of methods that we now have in the neurosciences for studying the thing called the mental apparatus, the object of the mental apparatus, they make inferences about how this thing works. Just as we in psychoanalysis have done from the subjective perspective of being a mental apparatus, so they have, from the point of view of observing a mental apparatus as a thing, made inferences about how this part of nature works. Now, here we have a problem. We have two different models of how this thing works. We have the model derived from psychoanalysis, that is to say from the subjective perspective, and we have the model derived from neuroscience, that is to say from the objective perspective. And those two models don't coincide. There is, for example, in the neuroscientific perspective on the human mental apparatus, nothing called the repressed. There's nothing called the id. There's nothing called unconscious fantasy. There's nothing called countertransference phenomena. There's nothing called the death drive, etc. All of these things that we have felt, there's nothing called the Oedipus complex. These are pretty central things to us. Core components of our understanding of how the mental apparatus is organized. And to neuroscientists, these things don't exist at all. Conversely, in the neurosciences, there are things called the seeking system. There are things called the procedural learning system. There are things called the audio-verbal short-term buffer. And so it goes on. All these things that they have carved the mind, the mental apparatus into, and they're saying these are the component parts of the mind, but we don't find them in our models. That, as I said, is a problem. Because, as I hope you all agreed when I said it at the outset, these are both descriptions of the same thing. You can't, just as you can't have two Mark Solmses, his brain and his mind, both of them are in fact Mark Solms, one monistic Mark Solms. Likewise with the human mind in general, the human mental apparatus in general. There is only one part of nature called the human mental apparatus. And yet we have two different descriptions of it which don't coincide with each other. So, as in the parable or the legend or whatever it's called of the blind men and the elephant, if you approach one thing from different points of view and you don't share your observations with each other, you're going to come to radically incorrect conclusions. If there are two blind men or three blind men grabbing hold of an elephant, one by the trunk, the other by the belly, the other by the ear, they're each going to think that an elephant is a very different thing. The one's going to think it's a flappy, flat thing, the other one a big, bulbous, round thing, the other one a long, curly, whirly thing. And if only they would say to each other, guess what I found? I found this, I found that, I found the other thing. An elephant is a combination of all of those things, and then you correct. You thought it was only this thing. You say, well, that's part of it, But that's another part I didn't know about. Let's add it all together. Let's see what can we construct out of this. That's the raison d'être of neuropsychoanalysis. We're saying, based on the historical premise that Freud himself and his early followers seem to understand, but many of us seem to have forgotten, which is that we are not saying that what we're learning in psychoanalysis has nothing to do with what they one day hopefully will learn in the neurosciences. We're saying when they learn something in the neurosciences about how this same thing works, we want to know about it. And we want to pool our resources, and we want to share our findings and try to construct a better picture of the elephant. So that's what we are trying to do with neuropsychoanalysis. Now, that's easier said than done for all sorts of reasons, not only because of the resistances within psychoanalysis, which I've already referred to. There are resistances from the neurosciences too. Those resistances we're well aware of. The stuff that we study and the observational perspective that we take brings to light things that people don't want to know, that people don't want to accept, also because of the methods that we've used, not only because of the emotional resistances. So it's been a long process in the establishment of the field of neuropsychoanalysis to slowly chip away at those resistances, to break down the barriers, to forge relationships, first on an individual basis, then gradually on an institutional basis, and so on. And we've made very good progress with that. It's far from a done deal, but there's a critical mass now of people working in this area together that I think that we can be optimistic that we are moving toward an era in mental science where both the subjective perspective and the objective perspective are given equal truck. I hope you see that it follows from what I've said about my philosophical framework derived from Freud, is that it is a matter of equal truck. It's not that everything we've learned in psychoanalysis must be reduced to neuroscience. It's just a different way of looking at the same thing. And vice versa. We're not saying everything that they've learned in neuroscience needs to be translated into psychoanalysis. It's not a matter of who's going to win. It's a matter of pooling resources, of sharing these two different perspectives, each of which has its own strengths and weaknesses. They're things that you can see subjectively that you can never see in a brain scanner. You will never see a feeling to come to the heart of the matter. You will never see a feeling anywhere except in subjective experience. They only exist in subjective experience. So we have something enormous to contribute to the neurosciences. We have to contribute to the neurosciences everything that can be learned from the subjective perspective of being a person. And that's half of what we can know. But conversely, because of the fleeting and fugitive nature of the stuff that we study, there's a great deal that we've learned about which there should be great uncertainty, and humility. Sadly, sometimes the way that we deal with that is to do the opposite and claim all kinds of certitudes in psychoanalysis, which is no small basis, no small reason why we have all these dogmatic schools in psychoanalysis. It's precisely because we're so insecure in our knowledge. So there's a great deal to be gained by both disciplines by moving forwards together, and we are now starting to do that. And this is moving now into the first of the main topics that I want to discuss with you. For my part, in the contribution I'm wanting to make to that sort of consilience between the two disciplines, the main things that I'm focusing on are the following. Firstly, I want to find in the brain the neural correlates of our basic psychoanalytic concepts. I want to see when we say there is a thing called repression, for example, there must be a brain mechanism for depression. It follows from what I said philosophically at the outset. If such a thing as repression exists, remember this is an inference. It's an abstract thing about how the mind works. We've studied it, we've seen it subjectively, we've seen its manifestations, we've inferred such a thing exists in the mental apparatus as repression. That means observing it physically, there must be some way in which that same thing can be observed physically. Because we now have the tools. We now, believe me, have the tools to study the brain in its mental functions extremely thoroughly and precisely. Everything that we've inferred about how the mind works in psychoanalysis, it must be possible to find the neural correlates of that. I'll say one last time, please note it's not reducing it to the brain. It's saying this is, if you look at the same thing from a physical point of view, this is how it's organized. And once you've done that, you have enormous advantages. Because once you've found the neural correlates of your basic psychoanalytical model of the mind, you can then start doing experiments on those concepts, using all the methods that neuroscience has to offer. And as I've said already, there are enormous advantages to looking at things from a physical point of view. They would never have seen them from a physical point of view because you only learn about their existence from a subjective point of view. But once we've discovered them and then found their neural correlates, then we can bring them into neuroscience. There are two advantages from that. The one is for us in psychoanalysis. We in psychoanalysis will be able to correlate our basic concepts with the anatomy and physiology and chemistry of the brain so that experiments can be done to advance our theory. Because, as I said, we have to have humility in psychoanalysis about how certain can we be about the things that we found. And that's because our method necessarily has to be as it is. I don't need to tell you what our method is. But you all know from your own experience how difficult it is to know anything for certain about even one person, even in one session. Let alone the whole blooming mind, the whole of humanity, the whole of the natural kind that we call the human mind. It's very, very difficult to know anything for sure. So we've reached some very good conclusions. We've got some very solid hypotheses. They are, in the words of Eric Kandel, a neuroscientist who won the Nobel Prize, the best models that we have about how the mind works, the whole mind, the real mind, the mind of a living person. By linking that to the anatomy and physiology of the brain, we have the opportunity of setting it all on a much more solid scientific footing, which can only be good for our field. It can only be good for our field in all sorts of ways. At the one extreme, we will be seen to be part of the family of sciences. We are not a religious sect that just has a school of wisdom of its own, and we don't care whether you believe us or not, we believe it. We can say, yeah, we believe it. We've based it on very careful study of the mind, and we're prepared to subject it now to neuroscientific scrutiny. But before we can do that, first we have to find what the neural correlates are, because you can't do experiments, neuroscientific experiments, on things like repression or on censorship or on the laws governing the unconscious, until you found what the neural correlates of those things are. But once you found the correlates, then you can. And it will advance our theory. It will hopefully help to collapse some of our schools of wisdom into one psychoanalytic theory. Because just as there can't be two things called Mark Solms, so there also can't be a Kleinian Mark Solms and a Freudian Mark Solms. There's only one. So somehow these things have to be integrated, have to be reconciled with each other, and in so doing we advance our theory. So that's the advantage to psychoanalysis. We're seen to be subjecting our findings to scientific scrutiny. That helps us in all sorts of ways, even in the most concrete ways that medical insurance companies in America are willing to pay for a treatment that's a scientific treatment. And these things are not to be sneezed at. That there's a standing for our discipline in the universities and the other academies, which is we're recognized as part of the rational and learned community of humanity. And all these things are already happening. Those benefits are already accruing. And I won't bore you with it in this presentation, but I can tell you that in all sorts of ways there's a radical shift in the status of psychoanalysis. I mean, even in journals like Scientific American have a whole lead article, Freud was right, and in Germany, Der Spiegel, was Freud right after all? And it's like, what Freud got right was a lead article of Newsweek. It's all a result of us bringing our way of thinking into neuroscience and showing, look, there are neurological things that correlate with this. Yeah, they are. Yeah, now you can see them. Seeing is believing. That's the kind of thing that's the advantage of studying the mind from a physical point of view. Also in terms of our own clinical work, though, let's never forget that our clinical work is based on a theory. That we don't just say, well, I'm just going to sit here and see what happens and say something. We have an understanding of how the mind works, which makes us listen in a particular way, which makes us intervene in a particular way. It's based on a theoretical understanding. That's why people with different theories do different things, because they understand differently what they're trying to do and how the thing works. To the extent that our models of how the mind works are wrong, and they must be wrong to some extent because we can't even agree amongst ourselves how the blooming thing works, and to the extent that there are things that none of us can see in psychoanalysis because they're things that you can see from a neuroscientific point of view that you can't see from a subjective point of view, just as it is the other way around. So we will inevitably build a better model of how the mind works. We'll benefit from it by getting a better theory, which will in turn lead us to do better psychoanalysis. Our techniques, our therapies are derived from our models of how the mind works. If, for example, to anticipate something I'm going to come to later, if we were to be compelled to accept that there is that dreams are random froth, a random firing of neurons which don't involve the parts of the brain that have anything to do with emotions and motivations and meaning and personal history. It's just like absolutely random. And that this can be shown, as some fascist neuroscientists decades ago thought they were showing us. That would mean something. Then, then if you're carrying on gaily interpreting dreams as if they reveal unconscious wishes, you're in cloud cuckoo land. That's what I mean when I say that what we do therapeutically and technically will be altered by, or must be altered by, please God will be altered by, advances in our understanding of how the thing works. But that's the first of two things that preoccupy me in neuropsychoanalysis. The one is, I want to find the neural correlates of our model of the mind so that we can benefit from neuroscientific approaches to the mind, to our way of understanding the mind. The second thing is that by doing that, and this is the second thing that I'm trying to do in neuropsychoanalysis, we make an enormous contribution to neuroscience because we humanize the brain. We bring the self into neuroscience. We point out to the neuroscientists the bloody obvious thing that the brain is not a muscle, that the brain is not a machine, that the brain is not a chemistry set. The brain is a person. It is a human subject. It is an agent in the world, which is driven by things like fantasies, that is driven by the sorts of things that we know in psychoanalysis make us tick, things which are completely left out of account in the neurosciences. They necessarily must be led astray if they leave all of that stuff out of account. So for me, the second of the two reasons why I felt it really compellingly necessary to develop a thing called neuropsychoanalysis is so that we can bring into the neurosciences the missing subject of the mind, the person, the being in the world, the lived reality, and the free will and agency and volition and spontaneity and relationships and fantasies and dreams and feelings and everything that must be central to how the brain works. If you treat the brain as if it doesn't have those things, you're going to be grossly misled as to how it works. And believe me, they have been grossly misled in many crucial respects because they have previously insisted on treating the brain as if it were a chemistry set, as if it were the same as any other organ of the body. It is not. The brain is radically different from any other organ of the body because, unlike any other organ of the body, it has subjectivity, it has feelings, it has wants, it has wishes, it has fears. And these things inform how it works. If you leave those things out of account, you will never understand how it works. Those things are central to how it works. Monism, monism, monism. You can't leave half of it out. Okay, that's the background. We are simultaneously making psychoanalytic and neuroscientific observations. Most observations simultaneously. We're doing both psychoanalytic and neuroscientific research at the same time. Most of the other methods are either one or the other. People sit in their analytic consulting rooms, and I call them wild neuropsychoanalysts. They sit in their analytic consulting rooms, and they listen to their patients, and they say, that sounds like, that might be the procedural learning part of the brain. Or this might be dopamine that's generating this particular thing going on, at the moment. Or this sounds like a deficient frontal lobe function in this patient. And they're just translating what they're doing into an inappropriate language, and they're not making any observations about the brain. So it's speculation. It's wild speculation. They're saying, I'm making psychoanalytic observations. I suspect, guess, think, wonder, maybe, fantasize that this might be the neurological correlate of what I'm seeing, and it makes me feel sort of like modern to talk neurologies about it, but actually you're not doing any neuroscience at all. You're just doing psychoanalysis and using a new funny language. A new school of wisdom within psychoanalysis. We don't talk Kleinianese, we talk neuropsychoanalysis. But it's nothing new. It's not even better, it's worse. Because it's like translating into the language of another discipline our observations on a purely speculative basis. The same applies the other way around. People do neuroscientific observations. They say, we found this neuroscientific phenomenon. That must be the same thing as what the analysts call repression. But they don't bother to actually see whether it is the same thing by actually having, in a psychoanalytic setting, the opportunity to explore, is that the thing that we call repression? Or they take the thing that we call transference, and they so denude it of its real meaning as to turn it into some tiny little thing that they can study in a scanner and get 10 people to all do the same thing. And they say, we've got 10 instances of transference here in a scanner, and we've imaged it, and now we found it's there in the brain. But, any psychoanalyst would say, but that's rubbish. That little silly thing that you're doing in your scanner is not what we call transference. Transference happens in the consulting room. Transference is operationalized. It doesn't only happen there. But the only way you can know that you're dealing with transference is in a psychoanalytical setting where this is how we defined it. In fact, that's how we discovered it. All of our discoveries, which led to our concepts in psychoanalysis, were clinical in a consulting room between a patient and an analyst, working together on trying to understand how this person's inner world is constructed. So, for me, the best neuropsychoanalytic method is a method which is simultaneously psychoanalysis and neuroscience. We're making observations about both sides of the equation simultaneously. And this is the method that I pioneered with Karen in the mid-1980s. And I've been fighting and fighting and fighting to get my colleagues all over the world to do this. And there have been all the resistances that I've referred to already, compounded by the problems of us not actually being there to hold their hands through all those resistances. But nevertheless, we've made progress, and now there's a lot of people using this method all over the place. And this is going to be the core of the training in neuropsychoanalysis that we're now bringing to South Africa, where people will be able to come and train in neuropsychoanalysis. It'll be in this method that I'm now about to tell you about. The other reason why I like this, just two other reasons I'll quickly tell you why I like this method. The one is that psychoanalysts can do it. You see, all the other neuroscientific methods, we're not trained in it. Some of us are, but we're weird. The ones of us who came into psychoanalysis via the neurosciences or trained in both psychoanalysis and the neurosciences. But most psychoanalysts or psychoanalytical psychotherapists, they either didn't go to medical school at all or never trained in any science at all, or if they did it 100 years ago. And, they left it because they don't like thinking like that, or they can't even remember how they, with that stuff. And now what they know about is how to do psychoanalytical therapy. They don't know how to do experiments. So what I like about the method that I'm going to tell you about is that it's something that all of us can do. Of course, there's a little bit more that you need, but it's basically the same thing as you do anyway. The little bit more that you need is what this diploma will be about, and you'll see as I'm going forwards, what I'm referring to. But it's not something that you have to go back to university to be able to do. It's something that you can do as an analytic therapist in your consulting room now. So we can contribute as full partners in this endeavor. The second reason why I favor this method is because it is simultaneously neuroscientific and psychoanalytic. As you will remember, psychoanalysis, Freud told us all those years ago, is a theory and a method and a therapy necessarily simultaneously. Psychoanalysis is, as a method of investigation leading to a theory, it is also a therapy. That's how our method works. And it works that way for all the reasons that you all only know too well. But the point of the matter is that this method that I'm going to tell you about is also a therapy. It also opens up possibilities of being able to help neurological patients in ways that are unheard of, that were unheard of before neuropsychoanalysis came onto the scene. So I'm now going to illustrate that method for you. First, I'm going to illustrate it from a primarily scientific point of view, and then I'm going to move on to illustrating it from a primarily clinical point of view, by which I mean therapeutic point of view, so that you can see what I mean. I'm going to speak on this as long as I have to, because this is the main thing that I want to convey to you, because for the reasons I've already said. I think this is the heart and soul of neuropsychoanalysis, this method. I'm going to illustrate it for you. I won't be able to probably do it in the half an hour left in this session. If I have to, I'll carry on into the after-lunch session. And then I want to talk to you about other things, that the other methods and other things that are happening. Okay. This method, which I'm calling the neuropsychoanalytic method, is derived from a very long-standing, common and garden, old-fashioned behavioral neurological method. This method was invented by Charcot. You remember him? No accident, possibly. Charcot introduced to the world a method called the clinico-anatomical method. The clinico-anatomical method worked like this. A patient wanders into your consulting room with a clinical problem. Like, for example, they can't remember anymore. They can no longer lay down new memories. That's the clinical phenomenon. And the clinico-anatomical method is applied in physical neurology and in behavioral neurology. I'm obviously focusing on behavioral neurology because that's what interests us, the mental side of neurology. The patient comes into Charcot's consulting room and he says, guess what, Professor Charcot, I can no longer lay down new memories. That's a big problem for me. It's my clinical state. And Charcot says, wow, poor you. Well, that's probably something's happened to your brain. We'll just have to wait until you die. When you're dead, we'll open your skull, we'll do an autopsy, and we'll find which part of your brain was damaged, and then we'll know which part of the brain makes memories. And the patient says, well, fat help to me. And he says, yeah, but the next time that somebody comes with the same problem as you've got, I'll know which part of their brain is damaged because I will have learned it from your brain. That's in a comical way. I see I'm being facetious about it, but that's how the method worked. You take a clinical observation, and then you correlate it with an anatomical observation. And you understand the clinical phenomenon in relation to its anatomical basis by making this link between clinical and anatomical. In those days, you had to wait for the patient to die. In Freud's days, you had to wait for the patient to die. You had to do an autopsy. Nowadays, in fact, since the 1970s even, in South Africa since the early 1980s, it was started to be possible to do a scan. The patient would come with a clinical phenomenon, and you would scan them. And you would make the anatomical observation immediately. And you'd say, okay, this patient can't lay down new memories. That's because, scan, their hippocampus is infarcted. And now we know that the hippocampus has the function of laying down new memories. This thing that us psychologists call laying down new memories, anatomists call it the hippocampus. There it is. We've now learned something about how the mind and the brain relate. We've related our cognitive theory of this conceptual entity called memory encoding. We've now found the anatomical basis for it and that's the method of clinico-anatomical correlation. That method that cognitive psychologists have used for ages, ever since scanners were invented, the cognitive psychologists immediately grabbed hold of this opportunity. They said, we've got a theory about how the mind works. We think memory is carved up like this, these boxes and arrows, and we think language like this, and we think perception like that, and we think volition like this, and we think skilled movement like that, and all of that. And they said, okay, let's go and have a look. Which parts of the brain do these different things? Here we are, clinically, here's a pure case of alexia. This person can no longer read. This is a cognitive deficit. Let's see, where's their brain damaged? Case 1, case 2, case 3, case 4. It's always there. Okay, that's the part of the brain that makes reading. I'm oversimplifying it, but that's what they did. In the case of memory, to slightly less oversimplify it, they said, okay, we've got a theory of memory. It's got encoding, it's got storage, it's got retrieval. This patient's got encoding problems. This one's got storage problems. This one's got retrieval problems. Those are the clinical phenomena. Now let's do scans. Let's see what the anatomical correlates of those things are. What they found was the encoding patients had, some of them had this lesion and some of them had that lesion. There wasn't only one structure. The same with the retrieval. They found these ones had lesions there, those ones had lesions there. Same happens with retrieval, and so on. So then it makes them think, hang on a minute, maybe our theory wasn't right. Maybe there are two different things called encoding. We thought there was just one thing. Now we find that there are two different types of this. Let's look at the patients again. So they go back to the clinical. And they study psychologically, what kind of memory encoding problem does this group have, and how is it different from that group? And they found they were different. And so they advanced their theory, and they said, okay, we no longer in cognitive psychology speak of encoding. We speak of this thing, which we'll still call encoding, but this new thing, which we're going to call consolidation. They didn't previously know it existed, but now they realized it existed. And that's how their theory advanced, through the clinico-anatomical method. The problem with cognitive psychology is it only looks at cognition. They've got a theory about cognition. They haven't got a theory about the whole messy thing called being a person, the lived life. We've got a theory about that. We've got a theory about the whole mind, which includes feelings, fantasies, early experiences, relationships, all of that. We've got a theory just like the cognitive psychologists had about how the mind works. In our case, how the whole mind works, not just the cognitive part of it. There is absolutely no reason why we can't do exactly what the cognitive psychologists did. We can say, okay, so here we've got an instance of this thing, here we've got an instance of that thing. Let's have a look, where's the lesion? Oops! The things that we describe don't come with lesions. Okay? So that's always been a very big problem for us. So the method that I'm suggesting starts from the lesions and goes in the other direction. And this is now I'm really getting to the heart of the matter. We have patients who come to us, those of us who work with neurological patients. The patient comes with a lesion. This patient has had a stroke there. We know where the stroke is. We've got the anatomical observation done. Now they come with a complicated psychiatric problem as a result of their stroke. Their minds have changed. Hello, of course their minds have changed because their brains have changed. It's the same thing. So they've got a piece of their brains are literally missing, have been damaged, have been removed by a stroke. And now they come with a mental disorder, which is the clinical phenomenon that flows from that stroke. And what we do, and here's our method, is we say, okay, I'm going to take this patient into psychoanalytical treatment, and I'm going to try to understand psychoanalytically what's happened to their minds. I'm going to describe, I'm going to conceptualize, as an analyst, as an analytical observer, I'm going to conceptualize in my language, operationalized in the way that we always do our operationalizing of our concepts. And I'm going to say, now how am I to understand what this thing is psychoanalytically, psychodynamically? What am I seeing here? How has this person's mind been altered by that damage, psychoanalytically conceptualized? That's the heart of the matter. In doing that, we're gradually able to piece together which parts of the brain relate to our concept psychoanalytically. That's what we've been doing. We've been doing that since 1985. We've been doing that for 24 years. and we've learned a hell of a lot along the way. That's the heart of the psychoanalytic method, the neuropsychoanalytic method. These patients who come to us are in trouble. They are confused. They are lost. They're depressed. They're manic. They are deluded. They're psychotic. They are shattered in their self-esteem. Their whole identity has changed, etc., etc. All these things. Their marriages are in a mess. Their relationships are in a mess. Their status in the job situation is in a mess, etc., etc. So simultaneously, when they come to us and we're doing our research on working out, analytically speaking, what's gone on here, what's changed in this person, using my psychoanalytical theory to describe it, I simultaneously am in a position to be able to help the patient. Once you understand analytically what's the matter with somebody, and the reason why they're prepared to cooperate with you in the process of trying to find out what's the matter with them, is you're also simultaneously trying to help them. Now, there are degrees of what can and can't be done with these patients, as in fact is the case with all of our patients. But there's always something that can be done. A patient who has had a stroke and whose life has been knocked upside down and whose mind doesn't work in a way that they recognize anymore, just to have an analyst or an analytic therapist, somebody who's prepared to sit there with them, give them the time of day to try to understand what they're experiencing and try to help them just with that, to try and reflect upon what they're experiencing, put into words what they're experiencing, and somebody who doesn't have the need to be, this, I don't like that, or bugger you, I won't put up with that. They behave analytically. It's a rare thing, it's a precious thing for these patients, that there's somebody who's prepared to sit with the awfulness of what's happened to them and try to make sense of it, just to empathize with them. That alone, and to contain them, that alone is an enormous contribution to these patients. And, I think it's an ethical matter, that neurological patients don't get this kind of treatment. It's because of this dualism that I was talking about earlier. Oh, that's the brain. Therefore, it's not the mind. What? This is not a person. This is an organ. We know that that organ is the person. And it makes absolutely no sense to me that those patients don't get the same amount of humane care as psychological beings as all of our other patients do. But there are resistances. As I told you, there are resistances on both sides of the fence. The neurologists think, well, I wouldn't send this to a psychoanalyst. Psychoanalysts say, I don't treat patients like that. But there's absolutely no reason why that should be the case. So we now, as I said, have groups of analysts and analytic therapists all over the place doing this kind of work, and it is absolutely wonderful. And that's just the least of the therapeutic benefits. I'll show you as I move ahead, that there's a hell of a lot more that you can do than just that. In some cases, the crux of what's the matter with them, until you understood it psychoanalytically, you didn't really understand what it was. And so you didn't know what could be done to help it. Because the mind, as we know, is a dynamic thing. It's not a jigsaw puzzle. You don't remove a piece and then the rest of it stays the same. You remove a piece of the mental apparatus, everything else is going to shift. And we psychoanalytically have some ways of influencing these dynamics. And so we can help rearrange things for these patients in ways that was unimaginable before. So, where do I go from there? All right, I probably should stop all these generalizations and start giving you an actual example. But do you get the idea of how the clinico-anatomical method works? The aim of it is, first and foremost, for us to understand psychoanalytically how the mind is altered by damage to a particular part of the brain. So how an anatomical observation can be correlated with a clinical observation that enables us, this clinico-anatomical correlation enables us to understand how the mind is represented in the brain, in psychoanalytically speaking. That also opens up therapeutic possibilities, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about second. So first, I'm going to talk to you about, I'll give you an example of the empirical, of the scientific task. And I have in here some notes, I hope. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to give you a very small little piece of clinical material. This is a patient. Oh, before I proceed, let me remind you that although these are neurological patients, they're people. They have private lives, they have families that love them, and they have their own privacy, and the same rules of confidentiality apply to these patients as to any others. You can't go running home and discuss, with your teenage children, this man. Okay. I asked too late whether you had a overhead projector here. My fault. Doesn't really matter. I can't show you slides. I can just show you little drawings. This is the brain, looked at from this side, sliced down the middle. So you're seeing the slice through the middle of the brain, looked at from this side. That's the back, that's the front, that's the top, that's the bottom. This goes down into the spinal cord. This is called the frontal lobes of the brain. This is called the ventromesial frontal lobes. Ventral just means bottom, mesial means middle. So this is ventromesial frontal lobes. And this man that I'm going to tell you about had a tumor which grew. He was 50, in his late 50s. He was an electronic engineer, and he got this tumor growing off the olfactory sheath. That is, there's a nerve going from the nose into the brain, which enables you to smell. And around this nerve is a sheath. And from that sheath, which is called meninges, from that sheath, he developed a tumor called a meningioma. And that tumor grew up into this part of his brain and started pushing against, amongst other things, his optic nerves. So he started to go blind. That's how he discovered that he had this tumor. And he went to a surgeon, and the surgeon did an operation and cut out the tumor. And he was better. He could see better, and he was fine. Unfortunately for him, the tumor grew back again, as can happen with meningiomas, and so the surgeon did the operation again. But when you do an operation the second time, there's a lot of scar tissue from the first operation. It's always a lot more difficult. And this time, during the operation, a bleed occurred, a hemorrhage. And so there was hemorrhaging into this man's brain in that area. As a result of that, although the tumor was removed, and his eyesight therefore improved again, and of course if it hadn't been removed, it would have just got bigger and bigger. It had to be removed. As a result of this bleed into the ventromesial quadrants of his frontal lobes, into the ventromesial frontal cortex, this guy developed a mental syndrome. So the clinical picture now, which we correlate with this anatomical picture, was a mental syndrome which we call Korsakoff psychosis, also known as Korsakoff amnesia. What is Korsakoff psychosis? Let me just tell you, first of all, remind you that if any one of you had the same tumor that he had, with a bleed in the same part of your brain, you too would develop a Korsakoff psychosis. So let's not think that this is something over there that this chap has, it's got nothing to do with us. It has everything to do with us. We all have brains exactly like this man had. He was just like you and me. He was an electronic engineer. He was in his 50s, living in Johannesburg, good, happy life, kids, everything going well for him. He developed a tumor. So could one of us, and this is what happened to him. It could happen to one of us too. So, I'm trying to just refer to the ethical dimension of all of this, that these patients are people like us and like the people we love. There's nothing, they're not a different species. Korsakoff psychosis is characterized by two things. And you'll see it's a psychosis. So, it's not something that shouldn't have psychoanalysts and psychotherapists involved with it. It's a psychiatric syndrome. It's a psychosis. It's the mind. Okay? And what do neurologists do with it? Mine, not my field, but it's caused by the brain sort of thing. And so, I don't know, go home. There's nothing I can do for you. Korsakoff psychosis is the following. Two symptoms. The first one is the patient can't lay down any new memories. They can't remember anything anymore. It's not only that they can't lay down new memories, all their old memories get jumbled up. The further back it goes, the more it sort of sorts itself out. It's called a temporal gradient. So they can remember their early life fairly well. But the closer you get toward the time that they had their in this guy's case, his operation, so it becomes more and more jumbled up. Until eventually, once you get to after the operation, the most recent period in their lives since the operation, they really can barely lay down any memories at all. They lay down the odd, isolated fragment. It's also very jumbled up in the sense that we call achronogenesis. So even the old memories that they remember very well, that are relatively stable, they don't know when those things happened. So there's a disorganization of their memory in terms of time. Achronogenesis just means loss of origin in time. So that's the first symptom, a severe memory disorder. The second symptom is that they don't know they've got a memory disorder. They think they're fine, and they have these things popping into their minds, which they think are memories, which are not memories. They either are misplaced in time, they're memories, but they've put them in the wrong place, and they don't realize that, so they insist, no, that's the right place. Or they're not memories at all. They're dreams or fantasies, as we would call them. Psychiatrists would say they're false memories. The way that one of the first things that we observed when we, as analysts, started to look at these patients was to say, well, it's not like come from nowhere. These are misplaced, like they are misplaced in time, so they also are misplaced in terms of category of a dream or a fantasy, a thought, or a memory. All of these things to these patients, they just churn these things out, and they think they're all memories, and they think there's nothing wrong with them, so they think this is what happened. The overarching term for this in neuropsychology is confabulation, false memory, misremembering, coming up with memories which are not memories, and not realizing that it's the case. So here are those two core features. Not able to lay down memories, especially new memories, but even the old ones are not so good, and it's all jumbled up. And secondly, they don't realize it, and they come up with false memories, false beliefs, which they think are perfectly reasonable because they don't know that their memory is not working anymore. What I'm giving you now is a common and garden behavioral neurology and neuropsychology. Those are the symptoms. Everyone knows that is a Korsakoff psychosis. That's what it's made of. It results from damage there. The damage there, in fact, the neuropsychologists, cognitive neuropsychologists who've studied this phenomenon, tell us that, in fact, there are two different components to the anatomy of this lesion that coincide with the two different parts of the syndrome that I've just told you about. The one, they say, which is the limbic part, the basal forebrain nuclei, the nuclei under the cortex in that area, which is part of the limbic system, which is part of the memory, the core memory machinery of the brain. And the damage to these anterior limbic structures leads to memory search problems. That's how our cognitive colleagues who've studied cognitively these patients, they say that they have memory search problems. They can't find the memories. It's an active part of memory that's not working. They look in their memories for a memory and they don't find it. They find the wrong one. It's a memory search problem. So you can see how that relates to what I've just told you, that they take something from the wrong period of time and they think it happened now. That's the result of the memory search problem. The second problem is associated with the frontal cortical damage. That's not the limbic part, but the cortex that surrounds that part of the brain, the frontal cortex. And that they call memory monitoring deficit. So first of all, they found the wrong thing. And then secondly, when they bring it up into consciousness, they don't recognize, they don't critically evaluate it and say, hang on, this can't be right. Let me try again. So that's the memory monitoring deficit. And it's related to these two different parts of the brain that are damaged in order to get this syndrome. Searching for the right memory, finding the wrong one, that's the memory search deficit. Secondly, you bring up the wrong memory, you monitor it inadequately, and you say, okay, that'll do. I believe that. Those are the two aspects of the syndrome. Now, I'm belaboring this because I want to show you two things. The first thing is it's only understood in terms of cognition. Okay, even though it's a psychiatric thing, it's a psychotic state. And these are people, imagine it when your mind's working like that, for you, let alone the people around you. All they're saying is, there's two pieces of this machine broken. The one piece of the machine searches for memories and it's finding the wrong ones. The other part of the machine monitors the output of memory and it's not doing its job properly. The other thing I want to emphasize is that it's deficits. They speak of deficits. They're not dynamic. They don't think in terms of dynamics. They say the machine is broken and two pieces of it are missing. Two pieces of the jigsaw puzzle are gone. The one is the memory search jigsaw piece. The other is the memory monitoring jigsaw piece. So this non-person has got two pieces of their jigsaw puzzle missing. That's how cognitive neuroscience works. And I don't mean to badmouth cognitive neuroscience, not that I'm very keen on it, but I'm wanting to show you this is the standard practice in pre-psychoanalytic, pre-neuropsychoanalytic behavioral neuroscience. This is what they do. What can you do for a patient with a memory deficit like that? Nothing. Because they've lost their search strategy. The part of their brain that finds memories is gone. And the part of their brain that monitors memories is gone. So what can you do? You look at the form of the thing, and you say, this is called a Korsakoff psychosis. It's not caused by the normal things that cause a psychosis, because the pieces of the brain missing. Can we put them back again? No, sorry. So now what do? Don't know, madam, but let me assure you, that this is due to the tumor that your husband had and the hemorrhage that he had, and I promise you that was the right operation, and I'm terribly sorry that it bled, but there's nothing we can do for him. But, I'm sure you love him, and you will look after him until the day you die. Bye-bye. That's what happens. So that's what happened to this man. 59 years old, he was married. He was married for many years. As I said, he was an electronic engineer. He trained in electronic engineering. He was very competent. He specialized in the design and maintenance of medical instruments, medical apparatuses, electronic apparatuses. And as happens to so many of us, things didn't work out in his marriage, so he got married again. And his new wife and him had a daughter. And that daughter was 3 years old when he had the second operation. Now he is in this psychotic state. He doesn't know who he is, doesn't know what's going on, doesn't know that he doesn't know, and his wife's supposed to cope with this. So she brought him to see me. I'm sort of worrying about the time. I'm not sure. I'm going to tell you the more detailed version. So what I did was, and this was one of the first patients with this syndrome that I saw psychoanalytically. I'd seen many patients with this syndrome because it's a very common syndrome, nothing unusual about it. I'd seen many patients like that. I know how to diagnose it. I know what the cognitive features of it are, and it's all based on formal behavioral descriptions. It's a very different thing when you sit as an analytic therapist with a patient like this and start trying to feel your way into the subjective experience of this patient and try to find out what the hell's going on here for this person. Who do they think they are, and why? Why are they remembering that and not that? Why do they say every day when they see me this thing over and over again? What does that mean to this person? And as you do analytical work with such a patient, so you start to be able to put together some kind of understanding of what's going on for this single human soul there with you. That enables you, hopefully, to be able to help, at the very least, to be able to contain. And from the scientific point of view, you start to see what is missing here. What's the matter here, psychoanalytically speaking? What has happened to the mental apparatus here that makes it work like this, that's turned it into this particular type of psychotic dynamics? How am I to understand this metapsychologically, psychoanalytically? Because once I found that, I'll know what this part of the brain does, psychoanalytically speaking, because that's the part of the brain that's been damaged in this case. You see, that's the clinical anatomical research question. And you need, first of all, to formulate what analytically is happening here. That's the clinical side, so that I can understand what it is that's been affected by the damage to this piece of the anatomy. If you come to reasonable conclusions in one case, then you test them in the next case, and the next case, and the next case. You start to sort of see, okay, this is how these guys work. And the more you see, the more you refine your conclusions, the more you start to feel confident, I got it right. I know now, okay, here comes one of them again. Like we do in our ordinary analytic work. The first time you see a patient with an obsessional neurosis, and if you've never read anything in our literature about it, you're at sea. It's like, why is this guy checking the windows all the time? I mean, what the hell is that all about? Why the windows? Why checking? Why, even though he knows that it's closed, does he still feel maybe it's not closed and he better go back? And so you sort of meander all over the place, and then eventually you come to a formulation in that one case. And then next one you see that's the same, you think, oh yeah, now I know a little bit about that. And so you slowly, until eventually we have a psychoanalytic theory of obsessional neurosis. Same applies with these syndromes. These are minds, these are people, they're coming to us, their dynamics are very weird, and we have to find our way through it, and then eventually we come to some conclusions. And now we've seen many, 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 many cases like this, but he was one of the first. I want to first of all give you just an illustration of what it feels like, of what I mean when I say that he has a Korsakoff psychosis, when I say that his memory search isn't working and his memory monitoring isn't working. Just a little illustration. Before I do that, I need to tell you a little bit more about him. I've told you so far, remember the confidentiality things. I am disguising some things in the usual fashion, but I'm not disguising more than I absolutely have to, because in the usual way, the more you disguise, the more difficult it is to be able to see the thing as it actually was. But I've told you, what I must add to what I've told you is that he was a good sportsman at university. He played rugby, and he was a rower. He was in the rowing team. And the other thing that I must tell you is that at the time that I saw this patient, I wasn't living in South Africa. I was still in London. And it's a sign of the desperation of this family that they actually yanked him over to London to see me. And I said, I can only see him for a limited period of time here, but at least I can get something. I'm not scared of these patients. I'm used to them. I as an analytic therapist, will have a look at him, try to get some understanding of what's going on, and then I'll refer him to a colleague in Johannesburg, which is what I did. One of your well-known colleagues here in Joburg, a psychoanalytic psychotherapist, then took this patient into treatment. So I'm just giving you early observations, really, of an analytic assessment of what was going on with him. Because the patient was all over the place, telling me the wildest things, and I was trying to understand what all of this meant and trying to make sense of how his mind is working, I did something that you normally don't do in an analytical assessment or an analytical treatment. And I tell you this partly because otherwise you won't understand what I'm saying, but also because I need to make the point that there are things you do with these patients that you wouldn't do with your normal analytical cases. And partly that's simply necessary from a technical point of view. It's not possible to work with them otherwise, and you have to make adjustments to them like we have to with children. You have to make adjustments depending on who you're dealing with. But also because the nature of the adjustments you have to make tell you something about how the patient's mind is working. It's also the things that you can't do with psychotic patients. It's got something to do with them being psychotic patients, and it helps you to understand why can't I do it the normal way. Helps you to understand, what it is that's abnormal in this person's mental life. In this man's case, he was telling me all sorts of things, like that he'd come to me and he'd say, "Where is my Ferrari?" And I'd say, "What do you mean?" And he'd say, "You're my mechanic. I brought my Ferrari to you for repair. Where is it?" So that's an example of a psychotic symptom that these kinds of patients have. To me, it made a difference because I was partly doing science, doing research, trying to understand what is the structure of the mind of somebody like this, to know whether he really had a Ferrari. It made a difference, So what I did, which was a change of parameters, was I saw him every day. After I saw him, I saw his wife. And then I would say to her, does your husband have a Ferrari? Tell me, what's this thing about his teeth? Tell me, what's this thing about his heart? Because these were things that came up. Did he have dental implants? He's been talking about these implants all the time. And then she'd say, yes, he had terrible problems with his teeth, but eventually they were fixed when he got these implants. And what's this about a heart transplant? He said he had a heart transplant. She said, no, it's not a heart transplant. What he did was he had an arrhythmia, and he had a pacemaker fitted. So I know something of the situation from the wife, or of the real state of affairs, which helps me to understand better what the fantasies might relate to in order to understand the structure of these fantasies a little bit. I don't have to do that with all of these patients. I did have to do it with the early patients where I really didn't know where I was. But it also helped in that this patient's wife was in a terrible state. Terrible, you know. And I also used the opportunity, since they were only with me for 2 weeks or 3 weeks in London, I used the opportunity also, as I understood better what was going on, to give her advice on how she might manage him at home when they go back to South Africa. They came also with their daughter, 4 years old. This chap, remember I've told you about his memory. He didn't remember most of the time that his wife was his second wife. Most of the time he thought he was still married to his first wife. He was just on the cusp of being able to remember that when I mentioned his second wife, he would remember, oh yeah, that's right. But his natural state was more to think he was still married to the first wife. Much worse, by far, was that he didn't know who this little girl was. You know, who had had 4 years of her life with her father, and, you know, now her father doesn't know who you are, and she's 4. So there you have it. Now I'm just going to give you a little snippet. This is just to give you the form of the thing, what it looks like. Okay. He came, oh, by the way, another parameter change was I saw him 6 times a week. Partly because I only had limited time with him, and I wanted to see as much of him as I could during that time. Partly because he was in such a disoriented state, and part of my exploration was to see what can we do about this. I thought the more I see him, the more chance I have of being able to see what can be done with him. So he comes for the third, he arrived in London over the weekend, I presume. I booked my first session with them on Monday, and I saw him same time, same place in the Anna Freud Center on Mondays at, say, 9 a.m. I forget the time. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday is a break. Then Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, like that, okay? And this was the third session. I'd go down into the waiting room. That's where I fetch him, bring him up to my consulting room, and then we would have our session. Then I would take him down to the waiting room, and then his wife would join me. We would go up. We would have a session. Then she would go down. The session with the wife's about half an hour, and then they would go off again. So the third time, every morning, I come down. This is the third time. Looks at me, greets me, tells me what his name is, having done it 3 times before. You know, this is the third time. Comes up to my room, sits in my consulting room, looks around, thinks he's never been there before. He says, it's quite a nice little room. So I said, it may surprise you, but you've been here before. This is basic orientational sort of stuff. Remember, don't think about this. I'm not trying to do analysis. I'm trying to explore with this guy, does he know he's got a memory disorder? This is what I'm doing, okay? So he says, it's quite a nice little room. I said, it may surprise you, but you've been here before. He says, yes, could have been last year, about the same time. So I said, no, you were here yesterday. So he looks really shocked. So then I said to him, today's Wednesday. You've been here twice before. Yesterday on Tuesday and the day before that on Monday. Do you have no memory of it? He says, I'll tell you what, I can't remember it. So I said to him, that's the problem. Your memory isn't working properly at the moment. He says, no, I don't think I was here. So I say, I know, you don't think you were here. That's because you don't remember you were here. It's because your memory isn't working properly. It's misleading you. So he says, no, but why, first of all, would I come here? I mean, it's about 10 or 30 kilometers from where I live. And it's a long drive. I wouldn't come here for nothing. So I say, you haven't come here for nothing. the reason you've come to see me, why Val, that's his second wife, why Val's brought you to see me is because you're not remembering. And I'm the sort of specialist who deals with those sort of problems. He says, Val brought me. So I say, yes, she brought you here to consult me because she's concerned about your memory. He says, when did she bring me? So I say, and then I realized I didn't know when he'd actually arrived. So I said, she brought you, you've been here a few days here in London. He says, in London? So I say, yes, she's brought you here to London to see me. And this is the third time I've seen you, to talk to you, to understand what's happening with your memory. Because it's definitely not functioning properly. That's why the things I'm telling you sound like news to you. Because you don't remember them having happened. So he says, well, they must sound like news to me because I haven't heard them before. So I say, that's right. It must be very difficult to believe me when I tell you that that is what's happened. He says, I agree. Now, the question is, am I going to have to agree on what's happened? Because, I mean, people can say it's happened, but meanwhile, nothing's happened to me. So I say, that's right. It's very difficult. So he says, just a moment, did you say we were in London? So I said, yes, look out the window. And it was winter. And it was snowing outside. I said, yeah, look out the window. And he looks absolutely shocked. Sees London skyline with snow. So he turns to me and says, no, that doesn't worry me. I mean, I know I'm in Joburg. So I say, you believe that? He says, I have to. So then I said, then why is it winter outside? It's so cold because we're in Europe. We're in London. He says, yeah, just because you're eating pizza doesn't mean you're in Italy. Okay, so you see the quality of the memory problem. He's not finding the right memories at all. He doesn't realize he's not finding the right memories, and he's quite happy that what he thinks has happened is what's actually happened. It's not absolute, it's not black and white. You can see a little bit of the fuzziness around the edges. So now I moved on with him, and we started to get into a more analytical kind of a relationship, and I started to begin to explore a little bit more in our usual sort of way what's going on with this guy. I must tell you that very interestingly from our point of view, and it's only the sort of thing that we look at, that means psychoanalytical types, the neurologists don't look at things like this. It's like, why, as I think I already have said, why does the guy have certain things that he says and not other things? Why does he say this and not like the thing, well, leave aside that bit. The main thing is, I saw him every day. He didn't know who I was, but he didn't say, today you're John, the next day you're Jack, the next day you're Jill. He said certain things, certain fantasies, transferences, if you will, that he had every time he was saying the same sort of thing. So that's, from our point of view, that's relevant. And there were certain themes which came up, certain sort of iconography, which is his personal iconography, and that's also why I had to talk to his wife, because we're interested in what is that thing, and to a neurologist, it's just the form of it. That is a delusion, or that is a Korsakoff psychosis. We want to know, but why this thing? So what I must tell you is that when I went to fetch him in the waiting room, he would frequently think that I was a client of his, that I was coming to him with my electronic problem, and he was advising me. So that's one theme. The other one was that we were both of us electronic engineers, and we were working together on a problem. So the two of us were the specialists, it was electronics, and there was this problem, which was somebody else's problem, and we were working on it together. Another common theme was that we were at university together. Now, this was university. And usually it was that we had just been on the rugby field and we were now having a beer together. It's like, where's my beer? Or we had just been rowing together. And now we were in the clubhouse after the rowing session. These things came up over and over again. And in one session, it'd shift from the one to the other and so on. Another thing I've already mentioned was he frequently thought I was a mechanic and that he had brought his car to me for repair. And, it was now he'd come to collect it. So on this particular day, which was the 9th session I've had with him, in other words, the second week he was there, I go down to the waiting room and he looks at me and he touches his head where he's got a scar because, remember, he had an operation. And he says, "Hi, Doc." And I think, wow, today I'm doc, and I've got something to do with his head. So we go into my consulting room, and I'm just going to give you a little snippet. Remember, I'm really doing too much already. I say to him, because I want to hold on to this piece of reality that he seems to be now aware of. I say to him, you pointed at your head in the waiting room. And he says, yeah, I think the problem is a cartridge is missing. We just need the specs, meaning the specifications. What was it, a C49? Should we order it? So you see, like, we're doing electronics. So I say to him, what does a C49 cartridge do? He says, memory. It's a memory cartridge. A memory implant. So I'm thinking, again, as I say, I keep saying the obvious. I'm thinking like an analyst. This is not the way that these patients are normally thought about. I'm thinking implant. Why implant? Implant. It was a memory implant. So he says, but I never really understood it. I haven't used it for a good 5 or 6 months now. By the way, it's 10 months after his operation now, this session. He says, I haven't used it for a good 5 or 6 months now. It seems we don't really need it. He says, it was all chopped away by a doctor. What's his name? Dr. Solms, I think. Yeah. And then he carries on. He says, but it seems I don't really need it. The implants are working fine. So I say to him, you're aware that something's wrong with your memory, and he interrupts me and he says, yeah, it's not working 100%, but we don't really need it. It's not working 100%, but we don't really need it. It's just missing a few beats. So I'm thinking about his pacemaker. It's just missing a few beats. The analysis showed that there was some C or CO9 missing. Denise brought me here. That's his first wife. Denise brought me here to see a doctor. What's his name again? He doesn't realize it's me. He says, what's his name again? Dr. Solms or something. And he did one of those heart transplant things. And now it's working fine again. It never misses a beat. So I say to him, you're aware that some memories are missing. And of course, that's really worrying. You hope I can fix it like those other doctors fixed the problems with your teeth and your heart. But you want it so much, you're having difficulty accepting it's not fixed already. So he says, oh, I see. Yeah, it's not working 100%. And he touches his head again. And he says, I got knocked on the head, I went off the field for a few minutes, but it's fine now. I suppose I shouldn't come back on, but you know me. I don't like going down. So I asked Tim Noakes, because I've got the insurance, why not go to the best? I asked Tim Noakes. And he says, no, fine, play on. Okay. So there's a little tiny vignette of what one sees working analytically, thinking analytically about a patient like this. Remember, this is not the therapeutic bit. I'm going to come to that later, although I will touch on it now. I just want to start with the scientific bit. So now, let's look at this patient. And I know much of what I'm going to say to you is going to be obvious to all of you because you think analytically. But you must remember there's complete news to neurologists that would not see this because they don't look at things subjectively. They don't care what does the Ferrari mean to this man. That's a subjective thing. What is an implant to him? What is a cardiac pacemaker or a dental implant to him? What is being a sportsman to him? What is Tim Noakes to him? And so on. This is our way of thinking. We see things about the man's mind that you don't see when you look at it from the outside as just a deficit of the brain. Of course, you can see the deficit of his brain. He's making memory searches, and he's finding the wrong things, and he's bringing them up, and he's monitoring it inadequately, and he's satisfied with his memories, even though they're not good enough for the rest of us. For example, you see, he's trying to find this thing, a piece of my brain which performs memory functions is missing. He's dimly aware somewhere that I'm not remembering right. There's like a latent, let's call it, the latent content of that thought is, I'm not remembering right. There's a piece of my brain missing. It does memory, So he starts searching for what's all this about. And what does he find? He finds, yes, there's been an operation, but it's on my teeth. Or, yes, there's been an operation, but it's on my heart. So you see there's a search, there's a field, he's in the right sort of field, but he finds the wrong thing. Do you see what I mean? Or, yes, something's happened to my head. I was knocked on the head. So it's not random. There's a meaningful connection between what he finds and what he's looking for. And that's this search. So there's a semantic field, as they say in cognitive psychology, and he's in the right field, but he finds the wrong item. That's the memory search problem. And then, as you see, he brings it to his mind, and he says, fine, I've had a heart transplant, or fine, I've had dental implants, or, and he's perfectly satisfied with that, even though it's grossly irrational and unrealistic by our standards. He's happy with it. And the things contradict each other that he's saying along the way. And, for him, that's fine. So that's what we can see it just as well as the cognitive neuroscientists can see it. But what else can we see? We see something else. Now, we think about the mind differently. That's why also we can see something else. It's not only that our observational perspective is subjectivity. It's that through studying the subjective world of human beings, we've learned things about how the mind works, and those are our basic concepts, and we apply those concepts. Also now to neurological patients. And so here's this guy. I think dynamically. I don't think in terms of jigsaw puzzles and where's the deficit, what piece of the machine isn't working. I think, what's going on here dynamically. And that enables me to see, as I'm sure I really am confident you'll all agree, that this guy, so the cognitive scenario is, here he is on the verge of realizing that he's had an operation. He's on the verge of realizing that he's consulting me about a deficit of his memory. That I would say we're in that domain. So he searches around in his memory and he finds these things. An operation has happened. That we know is true. Something is missing and it performs memory functions. That we know is true. Something has happened to my head. All of those things he says, and that is true. I'm consulting a doctor, Solms, this has got something to do with doctors, let me rather put it that way. All of that is correct. But look what he does. He says, there's this piece of machinery missing. It's not a piece of my brain that's missing, a piece of machinery. And you know what? All you therefore have to do is order it. That's the good thing about it being machinery rather than it being his brain. Because if it's a piece of your brain that's missing, you can't order it. So there is a tendentious element in what he remembers as opposed to what he's looking for. What he's looking for is a piece of my brain is missing that performs memory functions. What he finds instead is much better. A piece of the machine is missing, and shall we order it? All we need is the specifications, he reassures himself and me. Okay. Then, I'm trying to show you the same thing. I'm going to say it a few times in different ways, the same thing. He says, a piece of my memory is missing. I realize that. Memory function is gone here. Okay, he's on the verge of finding that. You can see he's on the verge of finding that. So what does he do with it? He says, but you know what? You don't need it. Isn't that good? Doesn't matter that it's missing. No, don't worry. He reassures me. You don't need it. I find for months I haven't used mine and it didn't matter at all. Okay. So that's again a tendentious aspect to it that we see because we think about emotions. We think about what does it feel like to be realizing, shit, a piece of my brain's missing and I can't remember a bloody thing anymore. It doesn't feel nice. So he has a defensive, well, it's okay, you can just order it. Or, no, it's okay, you don't really need it. Same thing again. He's aware. I've had an operation. I've had an operation. What operation have I had? Oh, it's a brain operation, which has gone horribly wrong. No, it's not a brain operation. It's a dental operation. And you know what? Those implants work brilliantly, And you saw I even tried to interpret this aspect with him. I've had an operation, but no, it's not a brain operation. It's a cardiac operation. It's a minor operation, as is a dental operation by comparison to what happened to him. And it went brilliantly, never misses a beat. So again, there's this tendentious distortion of the thing. Something's happened to my head, he's aware of. but it's not like something's happened to my head, I've had an operation on my brain, which has permanently and irreversibly destroyed my memory. It's that, something's happened to my head, but you know what, it's just a little biff, and it's temporary. And what's more, the best sports scientist in South Africa says it's okay, and you know me, I'm tough, and I can carry on. So that's the whole theme of this little vignette, over and over and over again. It's that I'm looking for a memory, I'm not so sure I'm finding the right one. In fact, I'm going to find a much better one. I'm going to say, no, the thing I was looking for, which is a little bit worrying, I don't like that. I think I'll rather find this other thing, which is much better. That is the psychosis. That is a wishful, omnipotent distortion of the material reality and a replacement of it by a psychical reality that he prefers. So you see the wishfulness, you see the psychotic defense, it's called disavowal. He sees a piece of reality and he says, no, it's not like that. And he replaces it with another reality that he prefers. That's how disavowal works. So when you look at it within our understanding of how the mind works, you see some pretty darned obvious things, which is, yes, the machine is broken. Yes, the memory search isn't working. Yes, the memory monitoring isn't working. Those are all ego functions. Those are all damaged. What has that done? It's released much more primitive ways of thinking because the mind is a dynamic thing. As reality constraints are removed, wishful, omnipotent ways of thinking come to the fore. And this guy can just change reality as he wants to because he doesn't have to. He's not constrained by the same secondary process, reality principle sort of stuff that you have to have